I would like to call Mr. Hearing Officer as our first witness, and this must be by video because of his schedule, Dr. James Enstrom, formerly of UCLA, who first began to raise questions about the science on which the regulation is based, and has had since dramatic impact on his career as a result of it. But we do have his testimony on video, and it's possible that we will have him on by telephone before the hearing ends tomorrow to answer any questions that there are. But if we could call on Robert to show the testimony of Dr. Enstrom. This was at a conference at which he attended with several other scientists. There are two of them we're going to use by video, and then we'll get to live witnesses. With your permission, we'll call the video.
That'll be fine. Our first speaker is Dr. James Enstrom. He's a PhD, of all things, and a research professor for the UCLA Janssen Comprehensive Cancer Center. He's president of the Scientific Integrity Institute of Los Angeles, trustee of the American Council on Science and Health in New York City, and a fellow of the American College of Epidemiology. He has some real credentials. Dr. Enstrom?
Can you get the volume up, Robert?
Thank you very much, Betty and Bill, for putting this wonderful program together, and for having me on the program, and for the introduction. I hope that this will be an informative session.
Can you stop it for just a minute? Can the members of the board hear the witness? Okay. The board members can hear it. So.
9-year PhD scientist in California. I'm a native Californian. I'm speaking from my heart. I'm going to say a number of politically incorrect things, but thanks to the wonderful country I live in, I'm allowed to say these politically incorrect things. I'm going to go through this presentation rather rapidly. I have a lot of slides, but what I would like you to do is, if you really want to dig into this, is go back and review what I'm presenting and study the information in more detail. This is going to, the object here is to show an overview related to the subject. I've titled it, "None of this is real." It's a quote that I'll reach about 1/3 the way through my presentation. It regards what I call misuse of diesel science by the California Air Resources Board. And just to make sure that everyone knows, this is what I've been told over the last couple of years when I've been investigating. The first 3 letters of diesel spelled D-I-E. And I think that's meant to send a message to people that I don't think is appropriate.
It's fine.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to basically try and cover 5 points. Understanding the definition of good and bad science, CARB diesel science from 1998 through 2009, the issue of whether fine particulate air pollution, PM 2.5, causes premature death in California. 4, exaggerations by the California Air Resources Board, and 5, actions to combat what CARB has done regarding its science and its regulations. Okay, first point, understanding good and bad science. My one example of good science is the internet, and so this has been called the greatest advance in communication since the printing press. It's fast, it's inexpensive, and it's comprehensive. It's based on honest scientific discoveries. I've listed 3 that are an important process has gone over decades. There are 3 Nobel Prizes in physics. One is the discovery of the electron in 1906. Second is the discovery of the transistor effect in 1956. And third is the invention of the integrated circuit in 2000. The internet has literally made this session possible, as I will explain. I started getting involved in this intensely with another speaker today, Dr. John Dunn of Texas. I met Dr. Dunn through the internet. I read, because of my involvement with the American Council on Science and Health, I read a column that he wrote called EPA Junk Science on Air Pollution Deaths. A year later, I published a paper, my own epidemiologic study, in the journal Inhalation Toxicology called Fine Particulate Air Pollution and Total Mortality Among Elderly Californians, 1973 to 2002. And then January of 2006, I began an email exchange with Dr. Dunn. That email exchange has continued ever since, but I didn't meet Dr. Dunn in person until June 22nd of this year at a conference we had in San Diego. Now, my one example of bad science involves the suppression of scientific disagreement. I consider this to be one of the premier examples of bad science of all time. This is a prison cell in the Soviet Union in 1943. It's where this man, Nikolai Ivanovich Vavilov, died. He was one of the world's leading plant geneticists at the time. However, he disagreed scientifically with this man, Trofim Denisovich Lysenko, who was a pseudoscientist. He really didn't have scientific credentials, but he was able to present himself as a scientist, and he gained the favor of the political leadership of the Soviet Union at the time. And he was able to crush dissent, and unfortunately that led to some bad consequences. Now, I know this is not politically correct to say, but I believe there's a somewhat similar situation going on in California. We have a lady in charge of the California Air Resources Board, Mary Dolores Nichols, who controls an agency with 1,300 employees and a budget of over $0.6 billion a year. I believe that a number of things are going wrong with this agency. I'd like to make a comparison. My definition of Lysenko pseudoscience involves Lysenko, a non-scientist who gained the favor of Soviet leaders, made false crop claims, used phony plant genetics, ignored genuine plant genetics like Mendelian plant genetics, purged opposing scientists like Vavilov. As a result, there were famines in the Soviet Union, and their agriculture was set back decades, and it's never come close to American agriculture. What I call Nichols pseudoscience involves Mary Nichols, an activist lawyer who's not a scientist. She's backed by major politicians. She consistently exaggerates diesel health effects, based on my opinion. Draconian diesel regulations are then adopted in California, not in other states, but in California. Dissenting scientists like myself and others that have attempted to present opposing views are basically ignored, and were certainly never funded by agencies like the California Air Resources Board. As a result, the California truckers, contractors, and the economy in this state are hurt, in my opinion. Okay, I'm going to go through quickly the CARB science from the time diesel was designated a toxic air contaminant. First, this process began actually in 1983 with the passage of a bill in the Assembly by a lady named Tanner, Sally Tanner, that's right. She was back. There were a number of powerful legislators at the time. There were both assemblymen. I put two of them, Gray Davis, Tom Hayden. This became part of the California Health and Safety Code. It specifies that there's a 9-member scientific review panel on toxic air contaminants. It's supposed to state or evaluate the health effects, toxicity of substances. The members are to be highly qualified and appointed for a term of 3 years. The members shall be appointed from a pool of nominees submitted to the President of the University of California, including 3 nominees at a time. A second bill was passed in 1986 by Marion LaFollette, an assemblyman from Southern California. This became also part of the California Health and Safety Code. What this did was they were so concerned about the appointment schedule of these individuals, they staggered the terms so that 3 expired in 87, 3 in 88, and 3 in 89. They gave precise ending dates for these appointments. January 1st. Okay? We wanted to have a systematic rotation on this panel. Then, 4 years later, just to show the mood in California for term limits, this was Proposition 140 that was passed, limited the legislators to 3 2-year terms in the Assembly and 2 4-year terms in the Senate. This proposition was passed 52 to 48, even though the supporters only were outspent 31 to 1. Okay, the scientific review panel members, I've listed 3 key members here. The chair is Professor John R. Freunds of UCLA. He was appointed, best I can determine, in 1984 and has been reappointed 7 times, and I'm not sure about the appointment for this year. It's up this year. I'm not sure if it's happened yet. Second is Stanton A. Glantz of UC San Francisco, appointed in 1986, reappointed 7 times, the last in 2008. Third is epidemiologist, who holds a position that I'm qualified in as epidemiologist, Gary Friedman, who's currently at Stanford. He was appointed in 1988, reappointed in 1991, and there's been no action on him since. He's still in position. Okay, this is the major decision about whether diesel was going to be a toxic air contaminant was done at 2 board meetings for the scientific review panel in 1998. This is an exchange between Dr. Witchy, who was on the panel. He's questioning Eric Garshik, a professor from Harvard, about a letter that Garshik wrote saying that he didn't want his studies used for quantitative risk analysis. And then Dr. Garshik responds that he's disturbed about having one slope describe all the data. There are many uncertainties, and there shouldn't be undue emphasis placed on the slope, particularly given the discussion that they were having, and it involved a number of uncertainties at that meeting. Nevertheless, the next meeting went ahead and made some major advances, and this is when the declaration, the identification was actually made. This is a statement by Chairman Freunds calling the meeting to order and saying that the tension level in the room was too low. They expected 500 truckers. That didn't materialize, so they were more relaxed. Okay, and my question is, given that this was the infancy of the internet and the use of email, what was the actual meeting notice for this meeting, which took place in the San Francisco area, and who received the notice? I personally doubt whether 500 truckers were even informed of this meeting. It would be nice to find the answer out. It's not possible for them to attend a meeting if they're not informed of it. Okay, as part of that same meeting, we come to the section that's the title of my talk. This involves the exchange between Professor Freunds and Professor Glantz, who are the 2 longest-serving members on this panel. Dr. Glantz says, if it comes out 5 times 10 to the minus 4, I'm happy. Chairman Freund says, none of this is correct anyway. Dr. Glantz, well, don't say that. Chairman Freunds. It's a risk assessment. Chairman Glantz. Excuse me, Dr. Glantz. I know, but thanks, you just got yourself sued. Chairman Freunds. None of this is real. Okay? I picked these sentences out because they express the real doubts that even the senior members on this panel had at that time. Right? And I think that what's resulted in the subsequent 11 years bears out the uncertainty. Nevertheless, look how this meeting proceeded. It was dominated, if you looked at, and I went through and tallied up all the lines of the transcript, which was on the CARB website. 38% of the lines are by Freunds, about 19% by Glantz, and 3% by the epidemiologist Friedman, even though most of the discussion was on epidemiologic studies. This is very discouraging that the epidemiologists basically just sat by and let the meeting be taken over by the other members. And there was no discussion of the major limitations of occupational studies exposed to diesel, primarily railroad workers and truckers, in terms of diesel exposure, smoking status, relevance to the general California population, and criteria for a causal relationship. These are all very important things that the epidemiologists should have been heavily concerned about. Okay, in any case, the identification was made on April 22nd, and then a letter was written by Chair Freunds on May 27th, where he made the formal identification and sent the letter to the Air Resources Board. Again, the risk factor used was 3 times 10 to the minus 4 per grams per meter cubed. This is almost the same number that Glantz was talking about earlier. He had talked about 5 times 10 to the minus 4. In other words, the number is very crude, but they've used it anyway. And there's no mention in this letter about the serious limitations that should have been talked about, whether occupational cohort studies of railroad workers and truckers have accurate assessment of diesel exposure and smoking history, whether there's any data specific to California. To my knowledge, they've never specifically looked at the situation in California in these studies. Also, it's very unclear whether truckers and railroad workers are representative of the general population in their exposure. Presumably, they have much higher exposure to diesel exhaust. Okay, the meeting of the Air Resources Board in July 29th, 1998 was very contentious. And there wound up being a delay in having the board declare diesel exhaust to be a toxic air contaminant. There were 66 legislators, 66 out of 120 at that time actually were involved in supporting a delay or reconsideration of this. The California Trucking Association was involved, and other industry groups were involved in delaying this. The primary concerns were whether the results applied to the general population. They noted that diesel engines had declined or had become much cleaner, down a level of maybe 10% of exhaust from unregulated diesel engines, and they were concerned about financial liability if there were diesel-related deaths connected to, say, lung cancer, and they were concerned about the economic impact of future regulations on diesel-related business in California. The transcript also reveals that Dr. Freunds was asked about the statement by Professor Garshik about using his study for quantitative risk assessment. And Freunds mentions that Garshik was actually repudiating this usage. But then he goes on to say that he was at the same time seeking out funding to do ongoing studies that involve railroad workers and truckers. Okay? What he didn't reveal was that 11 months later, he received $11 million, UCLA, to study the issue of particulate air pollution in the South Coast Basin. This money came from both the US EPA and CARB. And this is a major consideration because this is a major funding source, and in my mind it's academic issues that relate to whether these people have a vested interest in what they're doing on the scientific review panel. And I notice also it says he makes a statement in the press release that this study is going to have a major implications for air pollution policy. He uses the word policy as opposed to the word science. Okay, the August 27, 1998 CARB meeting was also highly contentious, but they reached a compromise whereby diesel particulate matter, not diesel exhaust as a whole, was declared to be the toxic air contaminant. And again, the primary concern at that time was whether diesel exhaust caused lung cancer in California. Again, there's evidence that there's continual cleanup of the diesel engines over this period, so their emissions were continually going down. Okay, immediately after this declaration in August of 1998, lawsuits started, somewhat predicted by Professor Glant's statement back in the scientific review panel meeting. The California Health and Safety Code provision says that any person can petition the state board to review a TAC determination made pursuant to this section. So there was a petition in July of 1999. It got dismissed by CARB 3 weeks later. Then there was a lawsuit filed at the end of 1999. That got dismissed in August of 2000. Then there's a lawsuit by a number of truckers. Apodaca was a trucker in Fresno, was the lead plaintiff. It was against CARB and the scientific review panel and others involved in the process. This lawsuit started in 2000 in Fresno County Superior Court. And after a hearing, the judge finally ruled, Judge Franklin Jones ruled February 2006 that based on his limited review, which all he was able to do, that he had to rule in favor of CARB. And basically he was determining whether the agency acted within the scope of its delegated authority. He wasn't ruling on the science. Now, after this ruling in 2006 at the scientific review panel meeting of June 2006, the main lawyer for the scientific review panel brought out something which I found was quite surprising. He said that the plaintiffs approached, I guess, the Air Resources Board and offered to forego their opportunity to appeal this decision. And he could only speculate about the motivations, but basically he said this put an end to the lawsuit forever. So I have no idea why the California Trucking Association and the other plaintiffs agreed to never appeal this, but in my mind it might be one of the reasons why there's been some reluctance on the part of the industry to continue fighting this. But I hope that the situation can be changed. Okay, now the off-road diesel vehicle regulations were approved in July of 2007. Implementation began in June of 2008. There's a lawsuit by the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association as to whether CARB actually has the authority to regulate off-road or any engines below 175 horsepower. And there's also a notice in the October Federal Register to this effect. This is an issue that I think is still under resolution. But the off-road rules are something that are having to be dealt with right now. Starting last year, there was a draft report prepared by CARB on the relationship between fine particulate air pollution and premature deaths by Dr. Ian T. Tran. I testified in front of the Senate Rules Committee on June 4th. Excuse me, there's a typo, that's 2008, about the confirmation of Mary Nichols as chair of the Air Resources Board. I raised points about the scientific review panel appointment process and about the evidence I believed showed there wasn't a current effect between fine particulate air pollution and mortality in California. Because of my testimony, a teleconference was arranged with me, Dr. Tran, and other key epidemiologists, Dr. Pope, Jerrett, Burnett in particular. Also, at the same time, 148 pages of mostly critical comments were sent in regarding the Tran report. I thought I was making progress at that point in July because I thought there was some effort to resolve the differences of opinion that I and a number of other scientists had. But the final report came out in October, and it basically ignored all the critical comments made by me, Dr. Dunn, others, Dr. McGolfgar, who's been involved with this issue for many, many years. Very, very disappointing. What I have done in the meantime, I've also tried to get information from a number of the other key epidemiologists. I've made 4 attempts with Professor Pope at BYU. They've all been unsuccessful, even though there's something known as the Data Quality Act and the Data Access Act that means that federally funded studies of regulatory importance must be made available in terms of some type of reanalysis. This has not been done. I also contacted Professor Garshek twice asking for his 1998 letter that was part of the scientific review panel matter. No response. Other attempts I've made to get the Garshek letter haven't been successful either. I've made additional attempts. There's a colleague at Harvard, Professor Thomas Smith, involved with the Garshek studies. He never responded. Michael Tuna of the American Cancer Society, who controls the database used by Pope and all the other epidemiologists that have primarily been relied upon by CARB, has not responded. Michael Jerrett of UC Berkeley, who's the only epidemiologist equivalent to me in terms of the studies on fine particulate air pollution and mortality in California, has not responded. I sent him a request for results, California-specific results on studies that he's working on, invited him to the conference. Even though it was only a few days ago, I haven't received a response to that either. Now, December 12th, the day when that Betty was the day of infamy that Betty was talking about, where there was tremendous testimony by many, many groups concerning the on-road diesel regulations, including my, I wasn't testifying, but I had submitted detailed written comments on December 10th. In spite of all of the information presented to the board, they went ahead and approved the on-road regulations 8-0. I had spoken personally to 3 of the board members before December 12th. A number of us in the room were part of those discussions. We notified them of the irregularities with Tran's PhD and the scientific evidence not supporting CARB conclusions. None of that was discussed during the December 12th board meeting. I got 3 legislators, Assemblyman DeVore, Senator Correa, and Assemblyman Belines, to write a letter to the board requesting reconsideration of the on-road rules. Basically, Mary Nichols replied to that a couple months later with no change, no reconsideration. Then in April of 2009, a notice of adverse action came out about the fabricated PhD of E.N.T. Tran. And then in June of 2009, a Pacific Legal Foundation lawsuit was released. You'll hear more about that later, regarding the scientific review panel appointment process. Excuse me. Okay, now, quickly, the evidence on premature deaths in California. These are the epidemiologists. Won't have time. Hope and Jerrett are two that I've contacted directly in the upper portion. I'm at the bottom right. These are all major studies that have been used. This is a map that came out in 2000 showing risk, part of a report from the Health Effects Institute. Jerrett was a key author of this report. Shows that the effect is primarily in the east, and California has a moderate risk. Again, interpreting this needs further clarification. I haven't been able to get any help on further interpretation. There was a presentation made to the EPA in 2001 which backs up this map. If you look at the bottom, it says the western part of the country in terms of excess PM 2.5 is minus 9%, which means there's no effect in the western part of the United States, which is what I've been contending. I published a paper in December of 2005 involving a database I obtained from the American Cancer Society related to other work that I've been doing for many decades. So my career goes back with the American Cancer Society in 1973. Basically, this was elderly Californians in 11 counties. And I found absolutely no risk since 1983. Found a small 4% increase during the 70s, but nothing since 1983. Then, this is backed up by a study that came out in December of 2008 by a group from Johns Hopkins. Basically, this involved Medicare enrollees, and they found no association in the western part of the United States. Again, backing up my contention, there's no effect in the western part of the United States. Then, just in June of this year, a report came out involving Professor Jerrett and Pope, and basically what this shows on a nationwide basis, the effect, if you look at the very bottom line, 1999 to 2000, this ratio of 1.014, that's 1.4% increase. These are tiny increases. It's not significant because the confidence interval, which follows the 1.014, goes below 1.0. So this backs up no current effect, even nationwide. So whatever effect existed in the 80s doesn't seem to be existing now. Okay, this is a statement by Dr. Phelan, who will speak later, about what is known as the particulate mass fallacy. And I won't read it now. It involves the fact that particulate matter is different in California than it is in other parts of the country, and there's enough uncertainty that we need to slow down. And Dr. Phelan is an expert on this. I'll let him speak about more. He also wrote in a 2004 paper some very profound words about being at a crossroads on air pollutant regulation. And one approach involves doing the proper research and using proper science. Another is using regulations driven by public fear, politics, and pressure groups. I think he'll also speak on this subject. Exaggerations by CARB. I'm just going to give you a couple of ideas of what they've done systematically. The decision on the on-road rules made December 12th. On December 16th, 4 days later, they posted on their website a 10-page summary called Health Effects of Diesel Exhaust Particulate Matter. This 10-page summary has no reference to virtually anything that I've talked about up here. They just whitewashed all the comments that were submitted and all of these studies that disagree with what they want to promote as the relationship between PM 2.5 and premature death in California. Then, in May of 2009, they talked, I saw that they were going to talk about the study that Pope did in the New England Journal of Medicine in January about the relationship between declines in PM 2.5 and life expectancy. I sent comments on the, as you're allowed to do, public comments, May 27th, showing that when I did my own analysis, No matter what Pope found, there was no effect in California. Okay? Basically, CARB ignored the comments and then went ahead after their board meeting the next day, posted a press release on the Pope study. And I'll just briefly summarize. This is the comments that I submitted. You take the 11 counties that I have data. That's a flat line there. There's no relationship. That's changes in life expectancy as a function of changes in PM 2.5. It's a flat line. There's no effect. Okay? Now this disagrees with the nationwide results of Pope. So you look at the scatter there, and you can see that's the kind of what I say is very weak evidence in the first place, because the scatter is so great. Those are different cities around the country. But even though Pope found an effect nationwide, I found none in California. And California is the relevant issue here. Now, CARB also fails to point out what I say an overall perspective. Air pollution is not the only health effect that we have to deal with in our daily lives. We have a number of other important issues. And since they control almost 1% of the state budget to deal with air pollution issues, I think they have an obligation to try to look at an overall perspective. What I did is put together the total age-adjusted death rate, and this is all on a CDC website, which can be easily checked. I can show people how to do this. Shows that California is the 4th lowest of all states in the United States in total age-adjusted death rate. Not only that, Los Angeles County is lower than California as a whole. And there's only 2 states lower than California. And lo and behold, Hispanics within California in the United States have a death rate which is lower than the death rate in every single state in the United States of America. I bet that Mary Nichols has never told any Hispanic legislator or any Hispanic audience that they have extremely low death rates, and that by my conclusion they would be suffering not from premature death but possibly premature unemployment. Okay, actions to combat CARB. First of all, I think we've got a number of scientific issues. The fact that there is a lot of evidence that I've generated that there's no relationship between PM 2.5 and deaths in California. We've got other things like the particulate mass fallacy, and we've got evidence about what is the actual exposure of PM in the general population. These are all legitimate issues. We've got legal issues, the flawed scientific review panel, appointments and procedures that have been followed to make this declaration initially. We've also got limits on CARB regulatory authority that I believe they're trying to regulate more than they actually have authority to. And we've got economic issues, which all of the people in this room can relate to directly. I think a critique of CARB could be widely distributed to legislators, to the University of California, where most of the scientific review panel members reside, and a number of professors. Mary Nichols is a professor at UCLA, so is Professor Freund. Impacted businesses, trade magazines, talk radio. We're going to be speaking later with Dr. Bill Wattenberg, who has a program in Northern California. This is important to do. That's it. I guess that, oh, excuse me, one last slide. This is the PhD dissertation of Dr. Ian T. Tran. And I think, in my opinion, without knowing the people in this room, I believe every person in this room is more honest than Dr. Tran. He bought his PhD from Thornhill University for $1,000. I think this is a disgrace that this agency relies on a report written by such a person. That's my personal opinion. Thank you very much for letting me speak.
Mr. Hearing Officer, you entertain a motion for a recess at this point?
I sure would. I think we ought to take a 10-minute break, try to get back here as quickly as we can, get started.